Live on YouTube. Live on Facebook. Okay. Happy Purim! We are ready. Purim Sameach, a Freilichen Purim. This is such a big day. We do this every year. Thank God we're together, my holy brothers and sisters. We are going to be reading the whole Megilla. Where are you tuning in from? Who's in the house? Who is joining us today? It's Purim, thank God. Woo! Horatio Kennedy in the house. Owen Meyer in the house. Who else is with us? Who's tuning in? Lindsay Adams says Purim Sameach. I need your comments I need to write where you're tuning in from. Hit the like and love button. We got to signal to Facebook that something of value is going on here so more people will see it. It's ridiculous what's going on in the world right now. There's so much trouble and strife and fear and ugliness. And here we are lighting up the darkness, my holy brothers and sisters. Lindsay Adams has donated. Beautiful Lindsay Adams. You're the first. All donations today. They come into the Accidental Talmudist organization. You'll get a tax benefit. And they go straight out again to the poor. We can help people fulfill their obligation on Purim to give gifts to the poor. Wayne Michaels, God bless you, my holy brother. You fulfilled your obligation. You're sending money to the poor through us. I'm not going to do this all the time, but here's a shofar blast for everybody who donates to the poor and the needy today. Ho ho. Oh yeah, the excitement is high. The excitement is high. I'm not really one who's much into drinking and getting drunk. There is a commandment that people should drink on Purim to the point where they can't tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. I don't go that far, but I will make a l'chaim with you, my holy brothers and sisters. Let us make a l'chaim so that we can make a blessing and bring in Purim with some real energy. L'chaim, l'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shak ol nihibati v'ro. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. My goodness, that is the theme of Purim. God himself is never mentioned in the book of Esther. We do not hear God's name, and yet God's presence manifests throughout the entire story. The story of Esther, who became Queen Esther. A story for the ages. Timeless, incredible, miraculous, nothing short of miraculous, one miracle after another. People go out of their way, if they're the sort of people who don't like to see God in the world, they're related to Amalek, if they deny God's hand in the world, well, then they'll deny that all these events are orchestrated by our Father in heaven. They'll say, oh, it just happened. It's one coincidence after another. This story is crazy. It's a crazy story. If you hear this story, you say, yeah, well, it could happen. Then it's like you're turning off your own common sense. When you hear a story like this, the story of Mordechai and Esther, you've got to think to yourself, wow, God's hand is in the world. God is orchestrating events. I can't always see it, but sometimes things come together in such a way that it's crazy. And my friends, today, toward the end of our story, I will be sharing with you a story that is not from 2,000 years ago, nor 2,500 years ago, nor even 1,000 years ago. A story that's about 70 years ago, and which is predicted, laid out, named practically in the Megillah Esther, the book of Esther, written 2,500 years ago, predicts an event with astonishing precision, something that happened a mere 70 years ago in the recent century. Let us get into the book of Esther. It happened in the days of Ahasuerus. This is chapter 1. Remember, all donations go straight to the poor today. A Jew is obligated to give gifts to the poor on Purim. Should also give delicacies, right? Gifts to your fellow Jews, and hear the Megillah. Hearing the Megillah in English in a live stream does not fulfill a Jew's obligation to hear the Megillah read aloud. It should be done in person. However, this year, with the quarantining going on due to the coronavirus, there are possible exceptions being made. It may be that some people are quarantined. If possible, they should get somebody to come and read the Megillah to them in person. But if that is not possible, live streams may, I'm not saying they will, but they may be a substitute in certain situations. Consult your rabbi to know for sure. Chapter 1 of Megillah Esther. It happened in the days of Ahasuerus. He was the same Ahasuerus who ruled from India to Kush, 127 provinces in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne. As we read, I want you to keep in mind, as we said before, God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther. However, our sages teach that when the word the king is said in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, without naming Ahasuerus, this is a hidden reference to God. So watch for times that we mention the king without following it with the name of the Persian king, Ahasuerus. We also have a question, by the way, that I asked this morning in synagogue when we did the Megillah reading in Shul. Why don't we say Hallel? We say Hallel on Pesach, on Sukkot, on Passover, on Sukkot, all the days of Hanukkah, and several other days of the year, every month on Rosh Chodesh. Why don't we say the Hallel on Purim? And we'll see that this deliverance, this miraculous deliverance of the Jews in the times of Esther, was not a complete deliverance because we are still in exile. And so these lessons from Esther, they apply equally today as they did to our ancestors in Persia. Here we go. Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which is in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign. He made a feast for all his ministers and servants, the army of Persia and Media, the governors and the ministers of the provinces in his presence, when he displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the splendorous beauty of his majesty. He made this feast for many days, 180 days. These guys knew how to party. And when these days were completed, the king made a 7-day feast for all the people in Shushan, the capital, from the greatest to the smallest, in the courtyard of the garden of the king's orchard. He draped white, green, and blue cloths embroidered with threads of linen and purple wool over silver columns and marble pillars for the guests to sit on. He arranged gold and silver divans for the guests to recline on during the feast, on a floor of various precious stones, bahat and shesh, dar and sacharit. He instructed his butlers to pour with golden vessels, and there were vessels of different kinds, and there was royal wine in abundance as befitting a king. The drinking was as appropriate without coercion. For so had the king established, ordering all the stewards of his household to do in accordance with the desire of each and every man. Our sages teach from this line to do with in accordance with the desire of each and every man. Our sages ask about the story of Purim. What did the Jews do to deserve such an awful decree come into the world, right? That all the Jews would be killed on a single day. That's what's going to happen in this story. And we believe that when things happen to us, we do have some responsibility in what's going on. What is it that the Jews did? they would be saved. Eventually they would be saved. And yet this decree of destruction was real. It was issued. It went out to all the 127 provinces, and it caused us harm, enduring, ongoing harm. What is it that we did? Our sages say it's because the Jews enjoyed the feast of that wicked one. And by this they mean that the Jews in Persia thought, you know what? We lost the Holy Land. We lost the temple. This was a generation that saw the fall of the first temple, were exiled to Babylonia, which then became part of the Persian Empire. So that's how they entered Persia. And then they thought within a few years, you know what? We don't need the Holy Land. We've got it good here. The Jews have never had it so good. We could do whatever we want. We have great businesses going on. And in fact, our people have risen so high that we're invited to party at the VIP party of the king. The Jews have it good. And not only that, Jews are invited to the VIP party of the king, and he makes sure to give us kosher food, Jewish food, right? So that everyone feels like, hey, we've made it here, we're comfortable, we have nothing to worry about. And when Jews feel comfortable like that in exile, be careful, beware. Because then Jews lose their connection to their Father in heaven and say, we don't need our Father in heaven, we don't need God. We're in good with the earthly king. That's all we need. And that's when they that's when they're preparing their own way for a big fall, say our sages. Queen Vashti likewise made a feast for women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine. The 7th day. What is the 7th day? It's Shabbat. Our sages teach this was Shabbat. It was the 7th day of the VIP party, the special party. After the 6 months of partying for the whole kingdom, the 7-day VIP party. And it was on the 7th day of that party, and it was Shabbat. And here our sages draw a distinction, and this is what ultimately saved the Jewish people, because even though they thought they had it good and were partying with the king and were negligent of their relationship with God, when it came to Shabbat, they naturally elevated their speech, right? And on Shabbat, the Jews, even these disconnected Jews, would tend to speak about values, about God perhaps, about divine things, about what's important in life. Whereas their hosts, this King Ahasuerus and his ministers, on the 7th day, their conversation would turn to lewdness. And that's how they got into a conversation where the king ends up bragging that his wife, Queen Vashti, she's the hottest woman in the world. And that's what leads to him ordering her to come out wearing the crown, meaning only the crown. The king of the greatest country in the world, basically the king of the world, asks his holy, blessed, beautiful queen, right? He should treat her with the greatest respect in the world, the queen of the whole world. And he asked her to come out naked, wearing only the crown, so that his ministers could look at her and agree with him that his wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. It's that kind of lewdness, which the Jews did not participate in at this party, that actually led to them being elevated above their hosts. On the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bizeta, Harvona. Remember Harvona, he's going to come up again. Bigta, Avagta, Zetar, and Charkas, the 7 chamberlains who attended King Ahasuerus, the chamberlains who attended Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king, adorned with the royal crown, meaning only the crown, to show the nations and ministers her beauty, for she was of beautiful appearance. Queen Vashti refused to come. Why did she refuse to come? Because they were told her to come out naked. Of course she refused. She was a very royal person, much higher birth than Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus was a usurper to the throne. Vashti was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, who actually defeated Israel and sacked the first temple and caused the Babylonian exile. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's bidding, brought by the chamberlains. The king grew furious, and his wrath seethed within him. The king spoke to the sages whose knowledge those knowledgeable of the times. For this was the king's custom, to bring all judicial questions before those who were versed in every law and statute. Those close to him, so that he could present his questions to them, were Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memuchan. So the king had a tradition to consult with his wise men before taking a harsh decision. Remember that he had a tradition to consult with his wise men before taking a big important decision, like punishing the queen. These were the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the king and who ranked highest in the kingdom. By law, what should be done with Queen Vashti for failing to obey the order of King Ahasuerus brought by the chamberlains? Memuchan declared before the king. Who was Memuchan? This is Haman, the wicked Haman, who is going to become the center of this story, the wicked center of the story. Woe to him by whose hand punishment comes to others. This Memuchan, he's going to advise the king to get rid of the queen, execute the queen. And later, the same Memuchan, Haman, will advise the king to kill all the Jews. What will be the fate of this Memuchan / Haman? Himself to be destroyed, killed, hung on a gallows that he erected for the intended target of his hatred, and all of his family destroyed as well. The punishment he sought to impose on others would eventually impose on him. Beware, if you are a person who views that others should be punished and gives advice to leaders about how they should punish others. This is not a spot you really want to occupy. Woe to the one by whose hand punishment comes to others. It is not only against the king that Queen Vashti has sinned, says Memuchan to the king before his ministers. It is not only against the king that Queen Vashti has sinned, but against all the ministers and all the nations and all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For word of the queen's act of belittling the king will reach all the women, causing them to also belittle their husbands in their eyes. For they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded that Queen Vashti be brought before him, yet she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's deed, will repeat it to all the king's nobles, creating much disgrace and anger. If it please the king, let a royal edict issue from him, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, and let it not be revoked, that Vashti did not appear in front of King Ahasuerus, and let the king confer her royal title upon another woman who is better than she. And the king's decree about what he will do to Vashti shall be heard throughout his kingdom, for it is great. This sentence, and the king's decree about what he will do to Vashti shall be heard throughout his kingdom. In Hebrew, V'nishma pisgam hamelech asher ya'aseh bechol melachusai ki rabah. It starts V'nishma, it shall be heard, right? Na'aseh v'nishma, we read in the Torah, the Jews said when they were asked, are you going to take on the commandments of the Torah, the children of Israel, in the wilderness after being freed from slavery in Egypt? We said, we will, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, right? We'll do what God says to do and then we'll understand it. But in terms of the actions of God, v'nishma, they are heard. They are heard. The decree of the king, this is the king without Ahasuerus, so it refers to God, asher ya'asa. The way that God works is he says what he's going to do, and then he does it. And what God says he will do always gets done. There is no falsehood in God, right? People say they're going to do things and then don't do it. God says he's going to do something and does it. The promises that God made to the world regarding the Jewish people when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai have all come true. On the king's decree, what he will do shall be heard throughout our kingdom, for it is great and all the women will give respect to their husbands, from the greatest to the smallest, says Memucan/Haman, advising the king. The idea pleased the king and the ministers, and the king did as Memucan advised. He sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its script, and to each nation in its language, saying that every man shall be master in his home, and that he speak the language of his nation. Chapter 2. After these events, when King Ahasuerus's wrath had subsided, he remembered Vashti. Imagine, he was drunk, he asked his wife, the queen, to come out naked in front of his buddies. She said no. One of those buddies said, you should kill the queen. He's like, yeah, kill the queen. And he did. He had the queen executed. Then he wakes up with a hangover the next day. He's like, what did I do? Now, these ministers could be in big trouble. But what they do is they distract the king. Hey, get yourself a new, young, beautiful queen, they say. So the king's attendants advise. When the King Ahasuerus's wrath had subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed upon her. So the king's attendants quickly advised, let virgin maidens of beautiful appearance be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and let them gather every virgin maiden of beautiful appearance to Shushan the capital, to the harem, under the charge of Hagen, chamberlain of the king, custodian of the women, and let their cosmetic lotions be provided, and let the maiden who finds favor in the king's eyes become queen in Vashti's stead. The plan pleased the king, and he enacted it. There was a Judean man in Shushan, the capital, and his name was Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. He had been exiled from Jerusalem with the exiles who had been exiled along with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had sent into exile. He had raised Hadassah. She is Esther. Esther has two names in this book, Hadassah and Esther. These two names are very important, and they refer to us, the children of Israel, when we are functioning in two different modes. Hadassah is a righteous soul who is connected to Hashem, right? This is a person who knows he's a Jew, cares about being Jewish, and really could be any person. It doesn't have to be a Jew in the sense that you know that you're a soul and that you come from the creator of souls. Esther is the mode that we're in where we come from that same place, but we're living in a world where we're distracted by all kinds of materiality and the material pursuits of the world, and God's presence is hidden to us. The word Esther means hidden, right? And this is a story about God's presence being hidden, though ultimately revealed. He had raised Hadassah, she is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden had beautiful facial features and a lovely complexion. And after her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as a daughter. It happened that when the king's order and edict became known, and many maidens were gathered to Shushan the capital under the charge of Haggai, Esther was taken to the palace under the charge of Haggai, custodian of the women. The maiden found favor in his eyes and won his kindness. So he rushed, in a way that he did not do for any other maiden, to provide her with cosmetic lotions and meals, as well as the 7 maidens from the king's palace to attend her, which she was entitled to be provided with. He treated her and her maidens differently, pampering them in the harem. Esther did not divulge her race or ancestry, since Mordecai had instructed her not to divulge it. Every day Mordecai would stroll in front of the harem courtyard to find out how Esther was faring and what would be done with her. When each maiden's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus, after undergoing the prescribed 12-month care for women, for only then would their period of beauty care be completed, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetic lotions, with which the maiden would appear before the king. She would be provided with whatever entertainment and music she requested to accompany her from the house of the women to the palace. In the evening, she would go to the king, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem under the charge of Sha'ashgaz, the king's chamberlain, custodian of the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless the king desired her, whereupon she would be summoned by name. And when the time came for Esther, daughter of Avichail, who was the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as a daughter, to go to the king, she did not request anything other than what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, custodian of the women, would advise. Esther found favor in the eyes of all who beheld her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the non-virgin women who had been gathered for him, and she won his favor and kindness more than all the virgins as well. He placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's stead. The king made a grand feast for all his ministers and servants, called the Feast of Esther, and in her honor he offered a tax relief for the provinces and gave presents befitting a king, all to entice Esther to reveal her origins. But she did not. When the virgins were gathered a second time and Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Esther would not divulge her ancestry or race, as Mordecai had instructed her. Esther followed Mordecai's instructions just as she had done while under his care. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains from the vessel guards, became angry and sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The matter became known to Mordecai, and he informed Queen Esther. Our sages teach, how did the matter become known to Mordecai? Mordecai, now living in Persia, right, in Persian Babylonia, was one of the leaders of Israel when the first temple stood. He was in fact a member of the Sanhedrin, right, the highest court. He was a very learned rabbi who sat in judgment as one of the judges of the Sanhedrin. He was a sage of Israel. And among his responsibilities to be in such a high position was to understand all the languages of the world. He was fluent in 70 different languages. That's how brilliant Mordecai was. And so when he heard these people plotting, and they thought nobody could understand them because they were speaking in a foreign language and mixing languages, Mordecai, could understand them. And that's how he caught on to this plot to murder the king. He passed that information to Esther so that she would get the credit for spoiling this plot against the king. When she reported the plot against the king, she gave credit to Mordecai. That's why his name would be written in the book of the Chronicles of the king. And from this, we learn how important it is to give credit to others for goodnesses and for information and for wealth and treasure and for anything that comes our way. If we can honor somebody who is responsible for helping us, what happens? The divine blessings came to rest on both Mordecai and Esther. They were humble people who gave credit to others for the good that they were able to do. And because they both did that, they both were worthy to have divine blessings fall upon them. Esther informed the king of it in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true, and the two were hanged on the gallows. This favor that Mordecai did for the king was recorded in the book of Chronicles before the king. That completes chapter 2. We enter chapter 3. There are 10 chapters. The last 2 are pretty short. We're now in chapter 3. I remind you that the donate button is on. Funds donated to Accidental Talmudists today will pass straight through our organization and be given to the poor and needy. It is a mitzvah on Purim for a Jew to give charity to the needy. We can help you do that. We're going to pass it on to people who need it. Okay. Chapter 3. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite, and raised him up, and he placed his seat above all his fellow ministers. All the king's servants at the king's gate kneeled and bowed to Haman, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow. The king's servants at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" It happened that when they had said this to him day after day, and he did not listen to them, they told Haman to see if Mordecai's words would prevail. For he had told them that he was a Jew who could not bow to another person. We bow only to God. Haman saw that Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow to him. And Haman was filled with wrath. He disdained the thought of killing only Mordecai, for they had informed him of Mordecai's nationality. Haman sought to annihilate all the Jews throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. Let us review that for 1 second. Haman rises super high in that kingdom, gets to the very top, as it were. We're not told what it is that Haman did that caused him to get so high up in the kingdom and to have the king's ear. But he gets to the very top. And then it burns his butt that this Jew Mordecai will not bow down to him. Haman represents unchecked ego, right? Haman is those people in this world who think that everything that comes to them is because they're brilliant and they work hard and they're so cool and they're so awesome, and anything that comes their way is their just dessert. They're entitled to it because they did what they did to do to deserve it, and they're awesome, and all they think about is themselves. They are not grateful to the creator of the world for even giving them life, giving them an opportunity to excel. And because they're all about themselves, they never ask themselves how they can help others, what really is their mission in this world. When they're given these tremendous assets and possibilities to do so much in the world, they really only see that as a glorification of themselves. A person like that does not like to see that there are other people in the world who submit to their Father in heaven, who ask themselves, how can I serve? I was sent here by God for a mission. What's my role in this world? How can I do the most good? These people, Jews and others who serve God, they don't bow to people, right? They only bow to God, and that irks the Hamans of the world. Understand, Haman is a descendant of Amalek. And that's why we read about Amalek in the Parshas of the Shabbats that surround Purim. We remember Amalek, and we are commanded to wipe the memory. We're commanded to remember, to erase the memory of Amalek. Who was Amalek? When God freed the Jews from slavery in Egypt through incredible manifestations, 10 miraculous plagues, and then parting the Red Sea and drowning our oppressors in it, all the other nations of the world rationally said, yeah, those Jews, clearly they have divine protection. We're going to leave them alone. Amalek doesn't want to live in a world, right? Does not want to live in a world where God, looks out for a people whose mission is justice, mercy, charity, loving kindness. That's the Jewish mission, right? To make this world a home for God by making it a more just, kind, and moral place. Amalek, the Amaleks of the world hate that. They need to prove to themselves and to others that, This is a world that's unfair. Might makes right, and we're going to prove it, right? And so what Amalek did is they didn't go to war with the children of Israel by sort of making a frontal head-to-head, our soldiers versus your soldiers. The Amalek nation did like a guerrilla action, attacking the women and children and the old ones, the weakest Jews at the back of the line, picked off a few, and then ran for the hills, showing that, hey, see, these people are not invincible. They might have God on their side. Maybe this is not the right time to take them on and destroy them, but they're not invincible, and that shows that God is not completely powerful. That's how Amalek thinks. Haman is direct descendant of Amalek, okay? And Haman behaves this way, and the Hamans of this world, these are the people who are just going to always find a way to explain away anything that is beautiful, that is divine, that shows synchronicity, the kind of crazy accidents, right? Like some guy buying the first book of the Talmud on day one of a 7.5-year cycle. They would look at an event like that and just say, it's just a coincidence. What's the big deal? Coincidences happen. There's millions of people. Coincidences are bound to happen. You cannot listen to these voices because they're actually ridiculous voices. They're just serving their own need to know that they can selfishly pursue their own pleasures because it's not really a God-driven world. That's how Haman thinks, and a person like Haman can't stand that there's a Jew who won't bow down to him. And so he says, you know what? I'm not going to just kill this Jew, Mordecai. I'm going to kill all the Jews because Mordecai is just one of them. He represents what they all believe, that God made the world and that people should only bow to God and not to the big ego monsters of the world like Haman. Let's go on. Haman sought to annihilate all the Jews throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, a pur, which is a lot, was cast before Haman for every day and every month, and it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is one nation scattered and dispersed among the nations throughout the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are unlike those of any other nation. They do not observe the king's laws, and it is not in the king's interest to tolerate them. Our sages teach. One of the things that Haman said, these people, they don't follow your laws. They're into their own way of life. They even have their own holidays, right? They don't care about your holidays. They have their own holidays. And God looked at that and said, okay, you know what, Haman? You don't like that the Jews have holidays? There's going to end up being a new holiday, Purim, celebrating your downfall, Haman. This is one of the many ironies of this book. If it please the king, said Haman, let an edict be written and sent to the nobles of the provinces that they be destroyed. And I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents through the king's functionaries to be deposited in the king's treasuries. The king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, persecutor of the Jews. They made a money deal, right? The king sold the lives of every Jew in the kingdom to Haman for 10,000 silver talents. And then they had a drink over it. And our sages said this is similar to if you see a royal garment in a marketplace. Woe to the seller and woe to the buyer. For that garment is obviously stolen. It shouldn't be being bought or sold in the marketplace. Likewise, people who buy or sell people, right? People who buy or sell people, who treat people as commodities, whether it's through slavery. Thank God slavery is largely gone from the world, though not entirely obliterated, and we must do that. But anyone who sort of thinks of people out there in the world as commodities to be bought and sold, woe to that person, because they're buying and selling property stolen from the Creator. The king said to Haman, The money is given to you, and the nation is yours to do with as you please. The king's scribes were summoned during the first month of the year, Nisan, on its 13th day, and all that Haman had commanded to the king's satraps and the governors of each province and to the nobles of each nation was written, to each province according to its script, and each nation according to its language. It was written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent with couriers to all the provinces of the king to annihilate, murder, and destroy all the Jews, from young to old, children and women, on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month of the year, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Note that this decree that went out throughout the kingdom to kill all the Jews, it says all the Jews, but it doesn't mention the men. It mentions the children and the women from young to old. These are the secret of Jewish continuity. It might be the men, who fight in the army as the soldiers, but it's the children and the women and the old, right? The elders who pass on wisdom, the children who learn it, the women who take care that they grow up as righteous people. These are the ones who ensure Jewish continuity, and these were the ones that Haman directed his first ire at. He would kill all the Jews, but by name, he named the ones who ensure Jewish continuity, the children and women, the young and the old. The message of the letter was that the law be proclaimed in every province clearly to all the nations, and they should be ready for that day. The couriers hurried out by order of the king, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, the capital. The king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was in turmoil. The city of Shushan was in turmoil. From this, we learn out that once these edicts went out, it said that the Jews are all going to be killed on the same day a year from now. But now that the king of the world has said that all the Jews are going to be killed, in the capital of Shushan, the Jew-hating already became overt and active, and people were ripping off the Jews and pushing them around and beating them up and bullying them, and there was the equivalent of spray painting swastikas on the synagogues. That kind of stuff was already happening. Why? Why would such an edict come into the world? Remember, we're going to end up getting saved. Our lives will be saved from this. But an edict went out into the world in the king's name, right? God was orchestrating these events. It's something that Jews had to take seriously. We brought some of this onto ourselves. Obviously not the death penalty, but the fact that we had abandoned God in our lives and were relying on earthly kings to be our protectors was what led to us, one of those kings, those earthly kings, completely betraying us. We must never rely on earthly kings. We be political, we be smart, we make good relationships with people, and we do good for them in their countries. But we don't rely on them. Chapter 4. The donate button is on. All donations to Accidental Talmudists today get passed on to the poor. If you want to fulfill your obligation to give charity to the poor on Purim, we can help you do that. Chapter 4. Mordecai asks Esther to intervene. Mordecai knew all that had occurred. Mordecai tore his clothes and donned sackcloth and ash. He went out into the city and cried out with a great and bitter cry. He went up until the king's gate, for it is not proper to enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the order of the king reached via the couriers and his law was proclaimed, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, crying, and wailing. Sackcloth and ash were spread out for the masses. Esther's maids and chamberlains came and told her, and the queen was terribly afraid. She sent garments with which to dress Mordecai and to remove his sackcloth from upon him, but he did not accept them. Esther summoned Hattach, one of the king's chamberlains he had placed in her service, and she commanded him to go to Mordecai and find out what this was and what this was for. Hattach went out to Mordecai to the city square that was in front of the king's gate. Is it possible that Esther didn't even know that a decree had gone out to kill all the Jews a year hence? Answer, yes. She lived in such a sheltered existence in the palace that she didn't know what was going on among the people. Folks, if you happen to live in a place where you're sheltered and safe, read the news. Make sure you check in with the news, not only the main headlines, but the headlines that affect you, your family, your people, your tribe, whatever your group is. Stay current on the news of your group. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the meaning of the money that Haman promised to weigh out to the king's treasuries for the right to destroy the Jews. He also gave him the message of the edict that was proclaimed in Shushan calling for their annihilation, to show it to Esther and to tell her about it, and to instruct her to go to the king to beseech him and plead with him on behalf of her nation. Hathach went and relayed the words of Mordecai to Esther. Esther spoke to Hathach, commanding him to relay to Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes to the king and enters the inner courtyard without being summoned, his is but one verdict: execution. The only exception is the person to whom the king extends his golden scepter. He may live, and I have not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days now. Our sages, and I think it's the Lubavitcher Rebbe, learns out from this passage here, right? She says, I'm an outsider. I'm not close to the king. I can't get in close to the king. People who try to get close to the king, they get killed, right? And so we learn that there's sort of two paths that one can take to get close to God. There's the path of the righteous, which is gradually elevating, getting closer, refining yourself day by day, day by day, day by day, learning a little more, praying a little bit more, acting more like a mensch, becoming a more refined person every day. And that will bring you closer and closer to the spiritual home of your Creator. But there's another path, and this is the path of the wayward soul. The wayward soul, who's totally disconnected, has not been doing that work, and is not refining him or herself on any kind of regular basis, but at some point comes to feel a longing for God. The wayward soul can take a shortcut, a shortcut that is driven by desperation. A person who has no connection with God, but day by day starts to feel a longing for God, a longing to reconnect, a feeling that there's something empty in their life. Like, what am I doing? Why is that things don't make sense? Such a person can come to grow desperate and then just call out and say, God, please, give me a sign, show me you're there, let me connect with you. But a person who sort of calls out with that kind of sincerity, the way the Jews did in Egypt after hundreds of years, they cried out to God. You can short circuit that whole process. And this is alluded to when the queen says, yeah, I haven't been called, I've been distant, if I try to go near the king, they could kill me. And her uncle says, go. And she went, and of course she wasn't killed for it. She was brought into the bosom of the king, and from there the events of this story could flow. They relayed Esther's words to Mordecai. Mordecai said to respond to Esther. These are famous words. Do not think to yourself that you will find refuge in the king's palace and thus be saved from among all the Jews. For if you will remain silent at this time, relief and salvation will arise for the Jews from another source. And you and the house of your father will be lost. And who knows if at about this time next year, on the day of annihilation, you will retain your royal position and thus find refuge in the palace. In other words, who knows, but you were brought to this situation for this purpose alone. It's funny that he never says, if you don't speak up, we're all going to die. He's confident that the Jews will never be obliterated from earth because they fulfill a function that is needed in this world. The Jews were sent here, right, to be a light unto the nations, to make this world a more moral and just and kind place. The Jews won't be wiped out, but you may be, Esther, and who knows if you didn't reach this unbelievable situation in your life that you're the queen for just this moment. Esther said to respond to Mordecai, Go and gather all the Jews who are in Shushan and fast for my sake. This is related to the fast that we did yesterday. We fasted yesterday. Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days, night and day. My maids and I shall also fast in the same way. Then I shall go to the king, though it is unlawful, and as I have perished, so will I perish. Mordecai transgressed Torah law and did all that Esther had instructed him. What was his transgression? He fasted on Pesach. It fell out that this was Passover when they did this fast. Esther goes to the king. Chapter 5. The donate button is on. All donations today flow through Accidental Talmudists to the poor. You can fulfill your obligation to give charity to the poor on Purim by donating to us, and we will pass it to the needy. We're doing great. $450 for the poor. Can we get to 500? It was on the 3rd day that Esther donned garments of royalty and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing the palace. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the palace, facing the chamber entrance. It happened that when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes. The king extended the royal scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king said to her, "What need do you have, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it will be granted to you." Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared for him." The king said, "Rush Haman to fill Esther's bidding." The king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. At the wine feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your plea? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Esther replied and said, "My plea and my request is this. If I found favor in the king's eyes, and if it please the king to grant my plea and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I shall prepare for them. And tomorrow I shall fulfill the king's request." On that day, Haman left the king's presence happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and Mordecai neither rose nor showed fear before him, Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Haman restrained himself and went to his house. He sent for and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. Haman told them, now check this guy out, right? This is such a, how do I put it? It's such an ego-driven, self-obsessed egomaniac. It's a self-obsessed egomaniac. Haman told them of his glorious wealth and his many sons, and about the extent to which the king had promoted him, and how he had raised him above all the king's ministers and servants. Haman said, "Furthermore, Queen Esther invited nobody but me along with the king to the feast that she prepared. Tomorrow, too, I am invited to her feast along with the king. And yet, all this is worthless to me, because whenever I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have gallows made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then you will be able to go happily with the king to the feast." Haman was pleased with the idea, and he made the gallows. Beware having friends who give you strong advice. Hey, here's what you should go do. Extreme advice. They're not going to do that kind of thing. They love to see people, get in there and mix it up and take chances. They themselves, they won't take such extreme measures. They just want action to happen that they advise. And where are those advisors on the day of your trouble? Well, let's see where Haman's advisors are when he gets in trouble. Chapter 6. The action is speeding up now. Donate button is open. All donations go to the poor. Pass through us to the poor. We're at $500. Beautiful, my holy brothers and sisters. Can we reach $613 that we can give away to the poor today? Wouldn't that be good? Let's reach $613. Chapter 6. On that night, the king's sleep escaped him. He told his attendants to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had informed on Bigtana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains from the vessel guards, who had sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor and greatness has been accorded to Mordecai for this?" The king's attendants said, "Nothing was done for him." The king said, "Who of my advisors is in the courtyard?" Haman had come to the outer courtyard of the king's chambers to tell the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had made for him. Now, do you doubt that God is orchestrating the affairs of this story? The king's attendants said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard." The king said, "Let him enter." Haman entered, and the king said to him, "What should be done for a man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" Haman said to the king, "For a man whom the king wishes to honor, let them bring a royal garment that the king has worn, a horse upon which the king has ridden, and the royal crown that has been placed upon his head. And let the garment and the horse be entrusted in the hands of one of the king's governing ministers, and let them dress the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let them lead him on horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, 'So is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" The king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the garment and the horse, just as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew." Like, can you see the nice close-up, right? If you're filming this, the close-up on Haman's face when he hears that all this honor that he thought the king wanted to do for him is going to be done for the one he hates so much that he erected a gallows to have him hung today. And on this day that he sought to hang the Jew Mordecai in the gallows, this is the day that he, Haman, must parade Mordecai around the capital on a royal horse in royal garments and walk before Mordecai's horse and announce to everybody, "This is what is done for a man that the king wishes to honor." And let them lead him on horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, "So is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." And the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the garment and the horse, just as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Omit nothing from all you have spoken." Haman took the garment and dressed Mordecai, and he led him through the city square and proclaimed before him, "So is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." Mordecai then returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried to his house. Now here are the friends who advised him to build a gallows to hang Mordecai. He hurries to his house in mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends about all that had happened to him. His wise men and his wife Zeresh told him, if this Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail over him, for you will certainly fall before him." And while they were still talking with him, the chamberlains of the king arrived, and they rushed to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Now, remember, these are the same friends who said, "That Jew that you hate, Mordecai, build a gallows 50 cubits high and hang him on it." They knew that Mordecai was a Jew. Haman had told them that's why he hates Mordecai, because he's a Jew who won't bow down to him. And now they said, "Oh, well, if you're going to fall and you're starting to fall before a guy who's of Jewish descent, well, then that means you're just going to be wiped out." These friends are useless. You don't trust people who give you advice just because it's going to be exciting for them to watch you run around. chapter 7. We're getting near the end now. Donate button is on. That is all donations to the poor today. They flow through us. We've got 518 from 23 people. Beautiful, my holy brothers and sisters. Can we pass through $613? We're going to be doing organizations that feed hungry people, possibly also providing medical care. But it's really food safety that we're going to be most concerned with in passing through these donations, people who are hungry. Chapter 7. The king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. And by the way, pretty soon I'm going to be telling you this incredible story, which I mentioned at the beginning. When we get to it, it's unbelievable how the events of the Megilla 2,500 years ago predicted with astonishing precision something that happened approximately 70 years ago. I will be explaining that very soon. The king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. Again, on the second day during the wine feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your plea, Queen Esther? It will be granted you. And what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it will be done." Queen Esther replied and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted to me by my plea, and the lives of my people with my request. For my people and I have been sold as slaves, have been sold to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed. Had we been sold as slaves and maidservants, I would have kept silent. I am speaking of because the persecutor is not concerned with the king's loss of manpower and intends to kill us." King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is this? And which one is he who had the audacity to do such a thing?" Esther said, "A man who is a persecutor and an enemy. This evil Haman." Haman was aghast in the presence of the king and the queen. The king arose in his wrath from the wine feast and went to the orchard's garden. And Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther for his life because he saw that the king's hostility toward him was determined. By the way, I never understood why Ahasuerus runs out of the room when the queen just said, "Yeah, this guy right here, Haman, tried to plot it to murder me and all my people." Why does the king run out of the room? And I just learned today, it's a very interesting volume of the Megillah, this one here, a new one. There's a note here that very wealthy people in Persia in this time and place, when they would become really angry, which they didn't like to be angry, right? So when very wealthy people became very angry, they went outside and their servants would chop down a tree. And that would take a little bit of time, and then something magnificent was destroyed, and that would placate the rich person, and they would become less angry. That's what Ahasuerus did. He ran out of the room, and he had a tree cut down to placate him in his anger. But it didn't work. So he returns, and he's still angry. The king arose in his wrath from the wine feast and went to the orchard's garden. And Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther for his life because he saw that the king's hostility toward him was determined. The king returned from the orchard's garden to the wine feast chamber, and Haman was falling on the divan upon which Esther was reclining. The king said, "Does he also intend to have his way with the queen while I am in the palace?" As soon as these words left the king's mouth, the face of Haman was covered in shame. Harvona, one of the chamberlains who stood before the king. We met Harvona in chapter 1. He was one of those ministers who, along with Haman, advised the king to have Queen Vashti killed. Harvona, now his name is spelled differently with a hey at the end. And from that we learn out, our sages learn out, that this Harvona looks like Harvona, but is actually Elijah, the prophet Elijah, who sometimes comes back into the world to sort of fulfill divine missions that need an emissary to do them. So this is Elijah, looking like an advisor of the king, said, "Well, furthermore, there are gallows that Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke up for the king's good and saved him from assassination, now standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on it. They hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. The very evil that he plotted for the object of his hatred is the evil which befell him. And the king's wrath abated. Chopping down a tree did not abate it, but getting rid of this advisor who plotted to kill his queen and her tribe, getting rid of him and hanging him on the gallows he prepared for Mordecai, that abated the king's anger. Chapter 8. We're coming toward the end now, folks. Time is running out to donate to the poor through this show. We're at $518, 23 people. Can we get to 613 that we can pass on to the needy today? Chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, persecutor of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told the king how he was related to her. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate, which is now their estate. Esther again spoke before the king and fell before his feet. She cried and beseeched him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot that he had plotted against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, if it please the king, and I have found favor before him, and the idea is proper before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to all the provinces, ordering them to return the letters containing the plot of Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, who had written instructions to destroy the Jews who lived throughout the king's provinces. For how can I endure and survive while beholding the calamity that will befall my people? And how can I endure and survive while beholding the destruction of my family? I'm reminded a little bit of the movie, we just saw it a couple nights ago, Nina and I, called Harriet, about Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery and was free and could enjoy life as a free woman. But it was unthinkable to her that she could just enjoy life as a free woman while her family and friends were still enslaved. And she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad and went back, a tremendous risk to herself, and freed over 70 slaves personally and led an armed regiment during the Civil War to free slaves. Incredible story, great movie, very well done. A modern Esther, as it were, also a Moses in the way that she was freeing her fellows. King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and he was hanged on the gallows for raising his hand against the Jews. As for you, write letters concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name and seal them with the king's signet ring. Because a letter written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring should not be withdrawn. Meaning, the letters that were already sent out can't be canceled, right? Haman had letters sent out in the king's name that on a certain day, which is now coming up fast in the story, all the Jews would be killed. So you can't send out a letter that says, scratch that. That letter was wrong from the king. We're going to not do that. Instead, it's a different action. A new action can be taken, which is that the Jews can arm themselves, protect themselves, and destroy anybody who rises up against the Jews. The king's scribes were then summoned in the 3rd month, the month of Sivan on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai instructed the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the nobles of the provinces from India to Cush, 127 provinces, to each province according to its script, and to each nation according to its language, and to the kings according to their script and language. He wrote it in King Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. And he sent the letters by couriers who traveled speedily on horseback, riders of speedy camels, the B'nai Haramachim. The edict stated that the king had allowed the Jews of every city to gather and stand up for their lives, to annihilate, kill, and destroy every army of any nation or province that oppresses them, including their children and women, and to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Copies of the edict were sent to be proclaimed as law in every province, clearly to all the nations, and so that the Jews would be ready for that day to take revenge upon their enemies. The couriers, riders of speedy camels, left urgently and hurriedly by order of the king, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, the capital. And Mordecai emerged from the king's presence wearing a royal garment of blue and white, a large golden crown, a shawl of fine linen, and a garment of purple wool. And the city of Shushan celebrated and rejoiced. And this verse we say every Havdalah, when Shabbat ends, we say, for the Jews there was light and happiness, joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's edict had reached, there was happiness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Many of the Gentiles converted to Judaism, for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Chapter 9. 9 and 10 are short, and then it's going to be over. Chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, when the time for implementing the king's edict and law had arrived, on the day the enemies of the Jews had thought they would dominate them, the situation was reversed, and the Jews dominated their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to attack those who sought to harm them. No man stood in their way, for fear of them had fallen upon all the nations. And all the ministers of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's functionaries exalted the Jews, for fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was now the most prominent official in the king's palace, and his fame was spreading throughout all the provinces. People said that the man Mordecai was steadily rising in power. The Jews struck at all their enemies, attacking them with the sword, killing and destroying. They did with their enemies as they wanted. In Shushan, the capital, the Jews killed and depleted 500 men, as well as, now we're going to list the 10 sons of Haman. We're going to come back to this momentarily. They killed and depleted 500 men in the capital, as well as Parshandata, Dalphon, Aspata, Porata, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizata. And the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamdata, persecutor of the Jews, but they took none of the spoils. That day, the number of fatalities in Shushan the capital was relayed to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan the capital, the Jews killed and depleted 500 men, as well as the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the other provinces of the king? What is your plea? It will be granted to you. What is your additional request? It shall be done. Esther replied, if it pleases the king, let the Jews of Shushan be also allowed to do tomorrow what was lawful today, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. The king ordered this done. My friends, what is going on? The 10 sons of Haman were killed on the first day, the day that all the Jews were meant to be killed, and instead Mordecai and Esther arranged for all the Jews of the entire kingdom to be armed and ready. People were afraid of them, and then the people who were going to kill the Jews got annihilated by the Jews, including the 10 sons of Haman. They were killed on the first day. And then the king says to Esther, okay, what do you want? What else do you want? Anything you want, I'm going to give it to you. And she says, tomorrow, let it be like today, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged. My friends, they were killed on the first day. What does it mean to hang them on the second day? Our sages teach in the Midrash, there is a tomorrow that is today, and there's a tomorrow that is now, and there is a tomorrow that is later. I want to show you something amazing. There was a man, an evil man, a Haman type of man. And there were a bunch of them in the Nazi Third Reich, right? The leaders of the Third Reich who sought to do what Haman sought to do, to annihilate all the Jews in the world. Tragically, they succeeded in killing one out of every 3 Jews in the world during World War II in the Holocaust. Obviously, they did not succeed in wiping out all the Jews, and they did not succeed in elevating their Third Reich to anything other than disaster. They were completely demolished, beaten, annihilated. They lost everything. After the war, these Nazi leaders were prosecuted as war criminals. Hitler was already dead, but there were 10 big important guys, actually more of them, okay? There was 24, I think, that were brought to trial in the Nuremberg trials. 11 of them were sentenced to death. Normally in a military tribunal, a death sentence is carried out by a firing squad. For whatever reason, they made the death penalty would be carried out by a hanging. 11 were sentenced to hang, to be executed by hanging. One of them managed to get poison slipped into his jail. This was Goering, and he committed suicide in his jail cell. He was also known to be a cross-dresser. That left 10 to be hung on the gallows. This trial, the Nuremberg trials, there was so much evidence to present, it lasted a long time. And then strangely, they even allowed appeals within the structure of the trial, which extended it even more. Ultimately, there were 218 days of those trials. And something that should have completed in early 1946 ended up extending into the fall of 1946. The hanging, the execution would be carried out in October of 1946. That was after Rosh Hashanah of 1946. The hanging would actually happen on Hoshana Rabbah, sort of the end of the holiday season, the Jewish holiday season. The verdict was handed down between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. 10 men were sentenced to hang and were hung. 11 were sentenced to hang, 10 were hung. One of them was a guy named Julius Streicher. Julius Streicher was one of the primary propaganda officers of the Nazi regime. His job was to whip up Jew hatred in the population, and he had been doing that since the early 30s. He's the one who created the newspaper called Der Stürmer. Der Stürmer was just a propaganda rag publishing the vilest lies about Jews to get people to hate Jews and to set the scene for the Holocaust. Even as early as 1930, this guy Streicher, Julius Streicher, had looked to this, to the Megilla that we're reading, the book of Esther, and these chapters that we're reading now, when the Jews who were going to be wiped out in one day, and then the tables were turned, and they were able to kill their attackers, the ones who would murder them. The Jews were able to kill them first in self-defense, right? But Streicher pointed to these paragraphs and said, oh, these Jews are bloodthirsty. Look how many people they killed in one day. If they had their way, they would kill everyone that would stop them from being the ultimate power on earth. The Jews are just greedy, power-hungry people bent on world domination. It's a ridiculous lie that Jew haters have told for centuries to justify Jew hatred. Streicher was telling that. He pointed to the Megillah of Esther, the book of Esther, and singled out Purim as a holiday that exposes the Jews, right, as power-hungry animals. Streicher was led to the gallows in 1946, in the fall of 1946. As he was led up to be hung, some of the last words he ever said, and this is, you can Google this and look it up. It was reported by, I believe it was Newsweek or Time Magazine was there, the International Herald Tribune. There's plenty of press there, and they reported his words. He said, Purim Spiel, 1946. Purim Spiel, meaning Purim Fest or feast, the Feast of Purim. A Purim Spiel is actually like a play that people put on. Spiel is a Yiddish word that's also a German word. He says Purim Spiel, Feast of Purim, 1946. Very strange thing to say. Very strange thing to say by the arch-Nazi who hates the Jews, who's dedicated his whole life and career to killing Jews, who's now going to be killed in the Nazi war trial. And he's aware, he knows what Purim is, and he's aware that 10 Nazis are going to hang, right? They intended to kill all the Jews, and now there's going to be 10 hangings. And it's just like the 10 hangings that happen here in the Megillah. So that's maybe the ironic coincidence that Streicher noticed. But perhaps he was aware of an even deeper and astonishing coincidence. You talk about the hidden hand of God in the history of the Jews. Let me show you something, my friends. The year 1946, in the fall, so a new year, a new Jewish year begins with Rosh Hashanah. The year that began in the fall of 1946 was the Jewish year in the Hebrew calendar 5707. Today we're in 5780. That's the year that we're in that began this past Rosh Hashanah. That year was 5707. How do we write 5707? Well, we all know that we're in the 6th millennium, right? The 5000s. The first millennium was from 0 to 1000. The second millennium from 1000 to 1999, etc. We don't have to be told what millennium we're in. So we just say when we talk about the year, we normally say 707. 700. We would say 707. And we know that we use Hebrew letters. There are no numbers. There's no numerals. In Hebrew, we use letters to signify numerals, right? Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, etc. If we're going to say 707, we use the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Taf, which is 400, and the second to last letter, which is Shin, 300. That's 700. And then we would add 7, which is the 7th letter, Zion. Taf, Shin, Zion. When the Megillah of Esther was written 2,500 years ago, there were certain letters that were made small or large. We have this in the Torah also. When we read the Shema, it's written in the Torah, and the Shin at the beginning of Shema and the Ayin at the end are enlarged, and we have certain teachings about that. There are certain letters in Scripture that are traditionally written either large or small. We learn out things from them, but it was never explained to us that, hey, God dictated, or that when it's a book that wasn't written by God like the Torah, but let's say by a prophet, or the Psalms by King David, there's certain letters here and there with strange punctuation, or either enlarged or minimized letters. I now want to show you the list of Haman's sons that is in the scroll of Esther. Okay, so these are the sons right there. That's the list that we just read a moment ago, that they were hung. They were killed on the first day and hung on the second day. In Hebrew, I hope you can see this. Okay, so if you can see the Hebrew right here. Okay, so right here, in the first name, there is a small letter. Right there. See between the Dalet and the Aleph? That is a small Taf right there. Going down, I think this is the 7th name. There is a small Shin right there. A small Shin. These have been written this way for 2,500 years. And in the last name, there is a small Zion. Taf, Shin, Zion. 707. And there is an enlarged Vav, right there. The first letter of the last name is enlarged, an enlarged Vav. A Vav is 6. In the 6th millennium, in the year 707, there would be another tomorrow, another hanging of 10 enemies of the Jews. As Esther said, let it be the same tomorrow. She didn't need to have those guys hung. They were already dead, but she made an example of them for today, meaning the time 2,500 years ago, and for tomorrow, meaning our time. The people who rise up to try and destroy the Jews will have the same ending. And the fact that Streicher said Purim Spiel, 1946, as he was led to be one of those 10 hung, incredible. I mean, come on, if it had been 708 or 709 and it was close, wow, that would have been amazing. But 707, 5707, in the 6th millennium, the year 707, is precisely when 10 people who sought to kill all the Jews were hung on the gallows. Incredible story. Incredible. And by the way, if you look at the way it's arranged here in the Megillah, here are the names of the 10 sons of Haman, the S, right? Here's another column. And all that means is, and also was done to someone else. The S is a word that doesn't really have a meaning in Hebrew. It's a grammatical construction in Hebrew that our sages say, when it occurs, suggests duplication. It was duplicated. The 10 hangings in Esther's time were duplicated after the Holocaust. Why did the Holocaust happen? We can't understand that. But God had a reason for it. And the people who perpetrated the Holocaust have all been wiped out. And from the ashes of the Holocaust rose the state of Israel. Esther said, let the Jews of Shushan be also allowed to do tomorrow what was lawful today, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. The king ordered this done, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews of Shushan gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed the 300 men in Shushan, but took none of the spoils. And the rest of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered and stood up for their lives to relieve themselves of their enemies. And they killed 75,000 of their foes, but took none of the spoils. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, they rested on the 14th day and established it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. The Jews who were in Shushan gathered on the 13th and 14th of Adar and rested on the 15th and established it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. And thus the Perazzi Jews, those who live in cities that are unwalled, Perazot, make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of rejoicing, feasting, and a holiday, and the sending of portions of food one to another. Mordechai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews living throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, instructing them to obligate themselves and to celebrate annually the 14th for Jews living in unwalled cities, and 15th for Jews living in walled cities. The 15th of Adar is tomorrow. That's called Shushan Purim. And in fact, that is when they celebrate Purim in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a walled city that is still a walled city that was a walled city at that time. The days of the month of Adar, like the days upon which the Jews rested, having been relieved of their enemies, and the month that has been transformed for them from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, to make them days of feasting and rejoicing, of the sending of food portions to one another, and gifts to the poor. There is the commandment, send gifts to the poor on Purim. I'm very proud of our community. 25 people have donated. We've raised $625 that we will pass on to the poor in the name of our donors. There's still time, right? We've got one more chapter after this. It's a very, very short chapter. So if you want to donate to the poor and fulfill your obligation to give to the poor on Purim, time is running out. Use that donate button. And the Jews accepted as an obligation that which they had begun to observe voluntarily, and that which Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite, persecutor of all the Jews, plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and he cast a pur, which is a lot, like a lottery, to confound them and to destroy them. But when she came before the king, he stated verbally and conveyed with letters to reverse Haman's evil plot against the Jews upon his own head. His evil rebounded against himself, and he and his sons were hanged upon the gallows. They therefore called these days Purim. For the pur, P-U-R, the lot or the lottery, Purim is the plural, lots, and established the holiday and recorded its narrative for posterity because of all the events of this epistle, which recounts what prompted the characters to act as they did and what happened to them. The Jews established and accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants, that's what we're doing here today, and upon all who might convert to their faith, to annually celebrate these 2 days according to their script on their proper dates, never to be abolished. We have a teaching that when the Messiah comes, we will not observe other holidays the way we do now. They'll sort of become redundant. They'll be noted, they'll be marked, but we won't need other holidays the way we do now when we're in exile and before the Messiah comes. But Purim is eternal. And that these days be commemorated and celebrated in every generation by every family, in every province, and in every city, and that these days of Purim will never depart from among the Jews, nor will their commemoration cease from their descendants. The next year, Queen Esther, daughter of Avichail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote about the enormity of all the aspects of the miracle to establish the holiday with this second Purim epistle, and Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of Ahasuerus' kingdom, words of peace and truth, instructing them to obligate themselves to observe these days of Purim on their proper dates in the manner that Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, just as they had accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants the observance of the fasts and their lamentations, and the request of Esther confirmed the aspects of these Purim days, and the story was included in Scripture. Chapter 10. Tiny chapter, only 3 paragraphs. If you're going to donate to the poor using the donate button, everything passes through today to the poor, to the hungry. Donate now. This show is about to end. Chapter 10. Ahasuerus levied a tax upon the mainland and the islands of the sea, and the entire history of his power and strength and the story behind Mordecai's prominence, having been promoted by the king, are recorded in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, a respected leader to the Jews, and was found favorable by a majority of his brethren. Imagine, a majority of his brethren? Mordecai, who saved the Jews from certain annihilation, and now was, just created a great situation in the kingdom of Persia. The Jews were esteemed and respected and safe, and had a man, with second to the king, and a woman as the queen. But Mordecai, who arranged all that, was found favorable only by a majority of his brethren. He sought goodness for his people and spoke up for the welfare of all their children. The end. All right, my holy brothers and sisters. I think that, let me just see if there's any comments I should look at. This reading with the commentary, such a beautiful, inspirational gift. Thank you. You're so very welcome. Wow, it got stuck and I haven't been seeing the comments come through for quite a while. Thank you for your dedication, says Janice. Oh, thank you. Thank you, my friends. Thank you for joining in. It's been fantastic to share this year's reading of the whole Megillah, the book of Esther, with you guys. I hope you learned something. Though we do this every year, this is the first time I've shared that Julius Streicher story and the astonishing prediction in Esther that in the year 5707, 1946 in the fall, another 10 hangings would occur. Astonishing. My pals, sending you big love. Big love here from the West Coast. I'll actually be back later today because I'm doing AT Daily. We are taking a journey for everyone who's coming aboard with us through the entire Talmud. Right now we're holding by Shabbos Daf Hey, the 5th page, page 5 of Tractate Shabbos, the 2nd tractate of the Talmud. And we go live every day, and I share highlights from that day's page of Talmud in the 7.5-year cycle. We're about 2 months into that. My pals, sending you big love. All the best.